Hello, 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 everyone. Welcome to another episode of Hayden's Happy Hour. I'm very excited to introduce my guest today. All the way from Washington, D.C., it's Jonathan, or better known as Rousseau on TikTok. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me, man.
Appreciate you taking the time to do it. Well, I'm a big fan of your TikToks, and I'm kind of made my algorithm go into the humanities lane, so I guess that's how you showed up on my page to start. But I was kind of curious.
Yeah, the humanities is definitely a kind of a sort of up and coming area in TikTok because I know, like, at least when I first started making them a couple months back, there was not much, especially in the area of philosophy.
Yeah, yeah. What made you decide to go that route with your TikTok instead of the more typical route?
It's interesting. Originally, I started out making mostly political jokes, but I had one TikTok that was a philosophy joke that just really popped off. It was a joke about materialism. It was using the song Material Girl by Madonna with a bunch of materialist philosophers like Spinoza and Karl Marx and Hobbes. And it really popped off, and I realized, hey, I didn't think there was a market for this, but there is one. And honestly, online political discourse is really toxic. And not that online philosophy discourse can't get bad sometimes, but I'd rather deal with the philosophy discourse than the political discourse. So when I realized I could, I shifted my channel more in the philosophy direction, and it actually seemed to be the right move considering I've been relatively successful.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. I guess the if people are hating on you, the philosophy TikToks might be, or the hate might be a little more well thought out than the political hate. I don't know.
Yeah.
But
if they got if they've got hate and it's not just philosophy dumb, at least they've got some reading and some ideas behind the hate.
yeah, right. So you're actually a political science major. You told me before we started recording. Did your interest in philosophy come from your study of political science?
I'd say that that was for the most part because I had to take an intro to philosophy and an ethics class for my political science major. And basically, that's what got me really into it because I had a really good philosophy professor who got me interested in especially moral philosophy. And then in my own study on my own, I got interested in existentialism and basically the other areas of philosophy.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I was thinking about I guess my interest started in college too when I took that intro course because they make you take a writing credit in college, and I did not want to take business writing, so I took the
Fair.
philosophy writing class, and I think it's one of those things you either really connect with it or you don't connect with it at all, because I've found there's like two schools of thought on philosophy classes.
I've noticed that too. Either you really love them or you really hate them.
Yeah.
And I've noticed that most of the people that I know who are into philosophy, even if philosophy is like their major and their focus now, I've noticed that almost everyone who's interested in philosophy comes from one of two backgrounds. Either they were a big literature and classic literature person and got interested in philosophy through that, or they were into political theory and political science and got into philosophy through that. I am from the latter camp, of course, but I know plenty of people who are from the former.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I guess my interest, I don't know where it came from. I guess my interest kind of came from podcasts, which is what I was. Have you ever listened to the Philosophize This show? I guess that was my introduction to
Oh
philosophy.
yeah, I love philosophize this.
Yeah, Stephen West. I don't know if I guess he's a PhD, but if anyone wants to check that show out as an intro, it's a great intro to, it's a little easier to take in, I think, than just reading. And I think that your TikToks kind of are the same way. Like it's a great introduction to these ideas that are a little more palatable than taking a 20-page, 300-year-old document and trying to interpret it.
Yeah. And that's what I think at least is the whole point with my TikTok. Like the big, I guess if there's a purpose behind it, my goal is to make philosophy more interesting and palatable to the average person because there's definitely a lot of elitism involved in the philosophy community, especially in academia. And it's supposed to be like, oh, you can only do this if you're really smart and have read X, Y, and Z. And I'm just trying to make it interesting and understandable for the average person.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's really a great thing to do, because I think if you read the classical Greek philosophy, that was the whole point of what they were doing, is they would go out on the street corner and give these ideas or teach them to wealthy, I mean, a lot of there's elitism back then too, because they teach them to wealthy people's kids. But I think that that democracy, like, to relate it to politics, I think our democracy is only as strong as our citizens are informed. And I think philosophy is something a lot of people aren't informed about.
Yeah, I'm completely in agreement. I think that it is important to base as many aspects of your life as possible, especially when it comes to politics, in morality. I think it's
Yeah.
important to base things in morals, because even it definitely depends on your school of thought with morality, but I think it's extremely important to live a good life and try and make society as much better as you can as one person, to base your actions and beliefs and political action in morality.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the courageous viewpoint. And I see a lot of times in our generation, not to be like, I don't want to be like that old guy like shaking his cane or whatever, because I'm not an old guy, I'm in the young generation. But sometimes I feel like there's this really tilt of, kind of screw everything and everything's pointless and you shouldn't try to make the world a better place kind of attitude. Have you found that
Yeah,
at all in the philosophy community or in your life in
I
general?
mean, I found a decent amount of it, at least in my comment section and in some of my peers in real life. But as someone who definitely leans towards absurdism as far as the existential realm of things,
Oh,
I
yeah.
do agree that, at least from an existential view, I do not think that there is any intrinsic meaning to life. But I don't think that should stop us from trying to be happy or make the world a better place. Hence, rolling the boulder, trying to
Yeah.
imagine Sisyphus is happy every day and
Yeah.
just make the world a better place. Because, like, I mean, if nothing matters, why not be a nice person and try and make things better? Like,
Uh,
there's nothing stopping you.
yeah, I love the old Chinese proverb, when the right man uses the wrong when the wrong man uses the right means work in the wrong way. And that's a lot of how I feel about basing your morality solely on religion rather than your own morality, because I feel like that those two things are not interchangeable. And a lot of people like to make the argument that without religion there is no morals, and I think that's a flawed argument.
I would agree with that. I know it's definitely hard with a lot of, especially earlier Enlightenment philosophy, because they seem to base their morality in some sort of transcendental ideal. And it's hard to have a higher plane of ideals without, that's like a consistent higher plane of ideals without a deity. But the thing is, you don't need to necessarily base your morality in a higher plane of ideals. Like, for example, like Nietzsche's morality just generally revolves around, and Nietzsche's not my favorite philosopher, but there's a general consensus of you need to find your own moral, you need to find your own moral system that works for you.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's important, because it's hard to create an extremely black and white system of morality to any extent. Even with religion, it's hard to create a system in our world that's like, okay, this is wrong 100% of the time, this is right 100% of the time. It's honestly why I spend a decent amount of time making fun of Kant.
Oh my gosh. So you've created something else related to Kant that I will never get out of my head, and that is the fact that I always imagine him in a bathrobe. So now it's categorical imperative and bathrobe. Those are the two things I think of when I think of Kant.
I mean, that's at least one of those things is important to his philosophy. The other's just funny.
So
The whole Ghost of
where did
Kant
this, like,
character actually.
oh,
So the whole
sorry, go
Ghost of
ahead.
Kant character, yeah, it came from, honestly, it's kind of an odd character and origin, because it's mostly based around the fact that I'm very concerned with morality and have a decent amount of anxiety about morality and trying to act right and be a good person.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, especially when I was a little bit younger, I latched onto Kantian ethics pretty hard. And I would just like when I would do things that were like small but incorrect or like mess up, I felt like I kind of manifested my anxiety in this half joke of, oh, the ghost of Kant is haunting me.
Hmm.
And it was just an inside joke in my friend group. And eventually I just kind of worked it into my TikToks because I made a few jokes about like, oh, what you're doing is self-destructive. And it's like the ghost of Kant talking to me like, oh, I'm aware of that.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, it's like, I know, dude. That's funny. So, interestingly enough, that kind of parallels. That's funny that early in your moral development, you sort of had Kant as this sort of mythical figure, because a lot of times I think that's kind of how religion plays a role in people's lives, is it's like this old man looking down from heaven, judging everything you do. And it's kind of like Kant played that role in your moral development as well. That's kind of interesting to me.
he did. It was definitely a transition because I was raised pretty religious. And then in high school, I started to stray away from that. And in early college, I was introduced to morality. And initially, I rejected Kant and then came to over accept him. And I definitely think it was like, in my moral development, it was eventually just the replacement for the missing God figure that I had in my childhood was for a short period of time replaced by Kant.
That's really fascinating. So what denomination of were you raised Christian, or were you raised a different religion?
I was raised Seventh Day Adventist.
Oh wow! So that's near in my neck of the woods. Chattanooga is the big Seventh Day Adventist university.
Yeah, you're near Southern. I've got some friends down there.
Yeah, Collegedale. Yeah, we have some friends that live in Collegedale, and one of them was a professor at Southern. That's interesting. So that's a very strict branch of Christianity.
Yeah, it is. It's out there, and especially on the more conservative ends of it, it can get very strict and very legalist.
Mm-hmm, for sure. And that's kind of my family's kind of strange. I had some Southern Baptist on my dad's side. My grandfather was a Southern Baptist preacher, so that's very legalistic too. But then I also had my mom, who is the more kind of esoteric Christian. So I had a weird mix of ideas.
Yeah, I definitely, I definitely had a bit of a mix of ideas because my parents are both very, for the most part, scientifically minded, but also are in the Seventh Day Adventist community. And like, I wouldn't say they're super liberal Seventh Day Adventists, but they're leaning that way. So I was kind of growing up with the dissonance between like my parents' beliefs, my own developing beliefs, and then the beliefs of like the church itself. And it was, I think thinking critically about those things when I was younger was probably part of the reason why I ended up gravitating towards philosophy because I was thinking critically about these things and many of my peers were not.
Oh, that's yeah. So interestingly, I can really relate to you on that, because I feel like when you talk to certain people about considering what's moral and what's not, it's almost like somebody looks at you like, you think about that stuff sometimes. Do you ever get that?
Yeah, and it's kind of sad.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that it's sort of like philosophy pushes you towards this sort of examined life. And I think sometimes that's where the elitism can come from, because I think you can, if you get too caught up in it, you can kind of elevate yourself. And I find myself doing that sometimes, where I'm like, oh, my decisions are, I'm like, I kind of elevate myself, and I have to watch that a little bit.
I think it's definitely important not to get too big headed about it. I find myself, at least with moral issues, thinking where like I've been accused on several occasions of like I'll be nitpicking myself to one of my friends or something about like something I'm doing that I think is amoral. And they'll be like, oh my God, it's not that big of a deal. Do you think you're that much better than the rest of us? And I'm like, no. I think that because I have studied this much philosophy and I'm aware of so much about morality, it is because I have this knowledge, it is my moral duty to use it to the best of my abilities. That doesn't make me better than you. It just means I put my energy into this. And because I have this knowledge, if I ignore it, it's amoral. It's immoral. Sorry.
Yeah, that's definitely, yeah. So I think a lot of times morality, like bad moral decisions, come from ignorance, not from hatefulness. I've found a lot of times.
I would agree with that. A lot of the time it does come with that. I'd say of course, there are immoral decisions made from hatefulness, but they're generally in the minority.
Yeah. I would agree with that completely. So I wanted to get into a little bit of kind of political theory with you. So for someone who isn't familiar with political science, what would you say to a layperson? Like, what is the job of a political scientist?
Well, the job of a political scientist is to often study political theory and sociology and use them to create policy and apply them to day-to-day life and current political events. It's almost like you're taking the work of a philosopher, a sociologist, and like I guess like a current world issues student and putting them into one.
Okay.
Which is why I enjoy it, because it allows me to kind of stick my tentacles into a bunch of different areas because I've never been great at focusing on one thing at a time.
Okay, so yeah, the similarities between our personalities keep lining up because that's how I felt. I originally thought I wanted to be a doctor, and then I decided, nope, that's too specialized for me. So then I went towards philosophy. That's interesting. Okay. So you like to have your hands in different pots. So what did you want to be a policymaker? Is that the side of political science you want to go into?
My goal is to, after this, get some upper education in climate policy specifically, and I want to work in climate policy and climate advocacy.
Okay, that's a very admirable lane to go in with what we're facing right now, for sure.
Honestly, right now it seems quite Sisyphean. It's a good thing I'm an absurdist.
Yeah, for real. I've thought it really interesting, and you probably have a lot to say about this. I found it interesting that examples of policy like the Green New Deal are so scoffed at in this country. Do you have any thoughts on that?
It's I think it's I've been doing a decent. I actually did. I've been doing a decent amount of research on this for my political science classes, and actually recently just finished taking a religious ecology course as an elective, and it's definitely a cultural issue in the United States. It's a combination of the dissonance between religious conservatism and science and how they're seen as mutually exclusive, which I do not think they necessarily are. Given I'm not extremely religious, but I know plenty of people, and I am my professors included, my family included, various people who I've used as sources for this stuff, especially with climate research. It is not necessarily in contradiction to religion.
No.
We can actually use religious cosmologies, like religious worldviews, as a good way to promote ecology. I just think it's sadly due to the hyper-individualism of the United States, which has led to a decent amount of issues in the way our society is used as very much me instead of what can help everyone. Also on top of that, the religious dissonance that has occurred, which doesn't make sense from a theological point of view, to be honest, has created this kind of skepticism and hostility towards a lot of climate policy. And especially people on the far right have a tendency to feed into that, which is a shame.
Yeah, so that was a really succinct and very well, yeah, definitely. I agree with everything you said there. And being from the South, I'm very familiar with this sort of religious right fundamentalist viewpoint on theology, which to me is very surface level, and it doesn't have much depth to it. And when I think about, the great myth in Genesis being that we are the gardeners, this earth is our responsibility and it's our job to take good care of it. But then you have this attitude from Christians that's sort of like, get everything we can out of it because it's made for us. And it's sort of like very indicative of that hyper individualist sort of attitude that you were talking about.
Yeah, I think it's honestly, there's a theological disconnect where they see themselves as being created by God, but also above God's other creations. But when I've read Genesis and done my theological analysis for my essays, what I get out of it, and reading, of course, I read a bunch of Bible commentaries for this class too. From what I get out of it, the book of Genesis says, like you said, that we are stewards of the earth, and we are created in order to protect and nourish the other created beings. Not that we are above them and superior to them and should take advantage of them, but we are created to lead them and protect them.
Yeah, sort of, created in the image of God to me means that we're supposed to act like Christ towards our fellow creatures. Like, and what is Christ but the good shepherd? He's not the shepherd that takes all the resources that it needs to run its car and then leaves it, out in the rain or whatever, This idea throughout the Bible to me is that we're, like you said, stewards, and we're supposed to be good shepherds of the earth. And there's sort of this complete opposite viewpoint and almost a complete 180 on that. And it's sort of like the religious right has taken up the mantle of the entire narrative of Christianity in this country, which is really, I think, unfortunate.
It is, because it not only alienates people from coalitions with people who are religious, but it demonizes religion in a way I'm not comfortable with. And just because I'm not religious doesn't mean I don't understand the usefulness and purpose of religion in the lives of others. And I think that religion, especially in my future work dealing with climate change, is extremely important.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for example, if it wasn't for the Sioux people and their religion, and specifically like the Lakota religion, the Dakota Access Pipeline crisis, nobody would have been aware of it.
Yeah.
Like, they brought attention to it because it was going through their land and interfering with their rituals, their burial sites, and areas that are considered sacred to them. It's things like this where, like, a community's religious beliefs can bring awareness to it, and then their religious organization can help fight against it. And from my study, I've come to the conclusion that basically every religious cosmology, every religion's background and view of the universe supports protecting the environment. It's just been misconstrued, sadly, by various groups.
Yeah, and I think that it's been used as a very strategic tactic. And relating it back to politics, I think you'd probably be able to speak on this. Is I noticed that we found in the early 80s with the rise of Reagan, we found also the rise of the religious right. And I think that's a lot of related to these Christians that became popular in television and media. And we sort of saw this, like you said, hyper individualistic attitude come in, and sort of these celebrity preachers controlling the narrative of what Christianity stands for related to politics. And we sort of saw the rise of celebrity culture starting in the 80s. Would you agree?
I would agree with that, and I would agree that especially a lot of the whole televangelist megachurch whole construct thing has been kind of detrimental in a lot of ways to the organization and viewpoint of Christianity, from Christians looking at themselves and then people who are not Christians on the outside looking in on American Christians.
Yeah, so I think, you were talking earlier about not liking focusing on one thing, and I think someone who's a good political scientist or a good psychologist or anyone in sort of a softer science or humanities area, kind of to be well informed, needs to be able to dive into all these things, because it's really easy to see all these tentacles that connect between politics, religion, morality, whether it be secular or theistic, whatever you want to say. And so I think that one of the things I wanted to ask you about is, what are your thoughts on the sort of, and I think we may have a few disagreements here, but I'm interested to hear your viewpoint on the sort of backlash against identity politics from people like Jordan Peterson or Sam Harris or someone like that, in this sort of intellectual dark web that's come about?
I mean, I honestly am not a huge fan of identity politics. I'm of those people you just mentioned, the only one I'm really familiar with is Jordan Peterson, and I'll be honest, as someone who's in most people at least from my experience in the philosophical community, aren't huge fans of Peterson. But
No.
I mean, I do understand the validity of at least some of his stuff as far as like his self-help for making your life better. I do understand that does have its place. And I do respect him as a psychologist.
Yes.
But I do have problems with identity politics when they become divisive. I think that identity is important for the individual and is important for communities.
Yes.
But I do not think that identity politics used to divide and keep people from having coalitions is very useful.
Yeah.
Like, I find that, like, I mean, this is gonna, I'm not to out myself too much, but I do think one of the biggest political issues in our current era and for a while is social class and economic class. And I think that focusing too much on identities as a divider keeps people from being able to get important policy changes made that would help everyone of their standing in society, just
Yes.
due to the fact that they can't get along with people that are of different races and religions and such. And it's bad in America, but it's really bad in other places as well. Like, I know I was talking to a friend of mine about Lebanese politics, and their government is basically completely divided by religion. Every party is just by religion, and that's it, basically.
And there's no room for conversation there, because if you're supporting your politics based on your religion, then there's like, I'm right, you're wrong. That's the end of the argument. It's not really politics anymore.
Right. And I think it's extremely important. Like, one of my favorite philosophers and political philosophers is Deleuze, because he's all about new ideas and thinking critically about things.
Yes.
And I think that's an extremely important thing. If you like specifically vote for a candidate because of simply their identity or simply their views on one or two issues, I don't think that's conducive to a healthy political model. You need to be making informed decisions and looking at candidates as a whole, and also looking at the implications of the policy decisions that they're putting out, not just because a specific policy decision sounds nice on the surface.
Yeah, so that's exactly, I agree with you 100%. And I'll go ahead and out myself. I'm a democratic socialist. And so I identify with someone like Bernie Sanders, or I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Cornel West from Harvard.
I've read some Cornel West, yeah.
Yeah, so he kind of has the same attitude towards identity politics, and my opinion is it's a distraction by the establishment through the mainstream media and also just discourse at the national level. And I think it's a distraction used to distract from the fact that our politics are controlled by money almost completely.
I'm basically in complete agreement with you. I don't think identity politics has to be that way, but I think that's how it is right now.
Yes, and that's
Which
what
is
I'm
why I
trying to
have an
say.
issue
Yeah.
with it. I
Yeah.
think theoretically, if we could change to proportional representation and have more parties, and then those parties could be based on their smaller identities, but put their differences aside in order to create coalitions, I think that would be much better and a more
Yes.
productive use of identity politics. But in our current system, it's not very useful.
Yeah, so in a two-party system, so my friend and I were kind of spitballing the other day, and I wanted to run something by you. We thought that right now, the two-party system is the way it is for the current moment, and I don't see a path quickly out of that system. So our thought is a reform of the Electoral College, where states do not vote in coalition, rather that every district has one vote. So say a Democrat in Nashville feels like they have a voice because their representative votes for the Democrat, or a Republican in Northern California who feels like their voice isn't heard because California always votes for the Democratic candidate. Do you think that's a viable thing? Would changing the Electoral College to be more by district be a reasonable proposition?
I think it would. I think it would be probably better than the way things are currently done. But I mean, as far as the whole electoral college situation, I do, as a general rule, just lean popular vote as
Okay.
far as presidential elections. But I think that a lot of our electoral issues are less with the election of the president and more with the way that we have a winner-take-all system for congressional seats.
Okay.
Because so basically, there we have a winner-take-all system as opposed to a proportional representation system, which is proportional representation is how they do things in, say, um, the UK or South Africa, and basically just the percentage of votes for a party means that party has the percentage of seats in parliament. And that leads to much more simple pluralism. And like, is pluralism a word for that? It's much easier for there to be a multi-party system. But as far as the presidential election goes, I think that honestly the best way to do it would be is if we could, well, the issue is once again two-party system, but if we could just have a larger handful of presidential candidates and maybe have the primaries, like we could stay in the two-party system theoretically and just have each party put forward a number of candidates for presidency and then do it like they do it in France and have basically there's like, 5 or 6 and then the top two, whoever are the top two, then go up against each other in a second round.
Okay.
Because we saw that in France's last election, where Le Pen actually won the first round, I believe. But once it was down to just Le Pen and Macron, everyone else kind of banded together against Le Pen and elected Macron. And I think that's a way of avoiding, it's a way of making everyone feel more heard and also avoiding fringe situations in the electoral of a president. Not to show my power a little too much.
Yeah, it's like, the rise of a Donald Trump on a conspiracy theory like the birther, which is just clearly racist conspiracy theories about President Obama, or now, he's not really dismissing the birther conspiracies about Senator Harris. You're seeing this sort of weaponization of identity politics. And I really think it's interesting that political commentators on the far right, like Ben Shapiro, and maybe Dave Rubin and some of these other guys kind of accuse the left of being the only ones that play identity politics, where I believe that the right plays identity politics just as much. They just kind of mask it behind facts don't care about your feelings kind of things.
And even though they have plenty of feelings that are being hurt and plenty of ideas that aren't completely based in facts, the right likes to challenge the left and call them illogical and such, and that's more of a strategy than a reality.
Yeah.
Like they're just playing up to, there are a lot of SJW, in quotations, types on the left who have had a few moments on camera where they lost their composure, and the right has really capitalized on that.
Yes, and it's really been an us versus them narrative. Like, I think that people think, like, it's so funny to me that we started out this conversation talking about Christianity, and I'm just going ahead and taking a guess that neither one of us would consider ourselves conservative politically.
No, I mean, I don't like to, especially in stuff that's relatively public, I don't like to like go out there and say my exact ideology, and that's because I don't really align super specifically with an ideology. I've got a vague idea of something that but I just generally say I'm a bit to the left and leave it at that.
Yeah.
Because I feel like if I don't say that, it's enough to read in between the lines based on some of the things I've already said in here that I'm definitely not way off to the right.
Yeah, and that's kind of exactly, and I think that it's really like they accuse the left of saying things like, we're coming for your Bible and your gun. And I don't really know where that comes from, because I don't really see that on the left at all.
I mean, there are definitely some people on at least the moderate left who are very, very pro like gun control and banning guns. But there's a joke on political political internet forums and such that's usually, if you go far enough left, you get your guns back.
Yeah, exactly.
Karl Marx is straight up quoted of saying, like, it's like something along the lines of, by no means shall anyone make an attempt to disarm the proletariat or something like that.
Yeah, it's basically the Second Amendment with the word proletariat thrown in there. which
which
would
means the
actually
left
help.
will like it a lot more because it's got the word proletariat and it isn't in the Constitution.
Exactly. Well, instead of a well-regulated militia, it's a well-regulated proletariat. That's gonna be my campaign if I ever become I'm gonna change the Constitution to make it proletariat instead of well-organized militia.
Oh man, you'll definitely be popular in a lot of like leftist university circles. I
Oh.
cannot deny that.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to I think there's some elitism in philosophy and political theory that I think would kind of solve this problem of the divide between right and left in this country. If people realized how much the far left, not even the far left, let's just call it the reasonable left that doesn't play the game of, like you said, we want to control you and take your, like the left that doesn't play that sort of policy, you would see how similar kind of right-wing libertarian ideas and a lot of these left ideas do actually have some common threads through them.
Oh yeah, and there's an absolute erasure of libertarian left-wing ideals in the United States. Like, I mean, you've got prominent thinkers in America that are pro these things, like Chris Hedges and Noam Chomsky and such, but like they're kind of on the fringe, and I think that's deliberate.
Yeah.
Like, it's the whole political dialogue is especially like, oh, the left is pro big government. They want to be like the USSR, damn commies, et cetera, et cetera. Like, even when I was in high school, my history class was generally good for the most part, but whenever we would get into politics, my teacher would always describe politics as just a line, like the political spectrum is a line from big government to small government. And she would have anarchy on one end, communism on the other end, and like, you know, the Democrats and the Republicans kind of in the middle, the Republicans leaning more towards the anarchy end. And like I was annoyed and disagreed with that view of politics then, but the older I get, the more annoyed I get about it.
Yeah, because it's like it's taking away this spectrum of ideas and reducing it to, like you said, a straight line, and it's not a straight line. Just like religion is not a straight line. Nothing
And
in
it's not a straight
humanity.
line at all.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that they would conflate the Republicans as being closer to anarchy than the Democrats, when I would argue they are equally away from anarchy because they're both pro big government, just in different ways.
Yeah.
Like, at least the Democrats versus the Republicans. Like, so many people on the right like to say, oh yeah, I'm pro small government, and then vote for bills to give like another $1 million to the United States military so we can go build another base in some developing nation that we don't need.
Yeah. So I always like to, the way I think about it is the Republicans like big government with defense and social regulation, in a sense, like regulating morality and regulating the defense budget, and the left likes kind of regulating more social, in a social policy in a very different way, and then funding of
Right.
programs for citizens is a lot of the way it's looked at. Like you got the FDR New Deal sort of policies and those kind of developing those sorts of things, versus the right wants to develop defense and take economic regulation sort of out of the picture.
Right. That is the main difference I'd say between the Democrats and the Republicans is like laissez-faire versus Keynesian economics, at least on the surface, is what they seem to support. Because, you know, the left is like the Democrats and Republicans are definitely both capitalists, but the Democrats are more about, oh, we need to, at least in they don't always do it, but like they say that they're about creating like social nets and social programs well within the system of capitalism. And the Republicans are more about taking those apart and making things more laissez-faire, hands-off, like, you know, Gilded Age era stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Kind of. I think you could easily accuse the right of golden age thinking, and you could accuse the left of kind of a utopian sort of thinking, maybe.
I mean, definitely, especially on the far left, there is a lot of stuff that can be easily um, called utopian. But my political philosophy professor definitely liked to call out utopian and conspiracy theory as two of like the most dangerous insults you can use in a political dialogue, because like it's one of those things that like once you say that, it's like it's almost an ad hominem, but it really demolishes the other argument really quickly. You just like, oh, that sounds cool in theory, but it's utopia. And there's like, it's not really like that. You're just being a conspiracy theorist. Like suddenly a piece of your character and a piece of your argument is just gone, even though it's not necessarily a great argument in every case.
Yeah, that's definitely okay. I'd never thought about it that way, but that's definitely true because I think that right-wing ideas are often labeled as conspiracy theories, and like
And
you said,
ideas on the left are labeled that way too. Like, I mean, the right has their conspiracy theories about like, oh, Obama's birth certificate or like Pizzagate, and then people on the left saying, oh yeah, like both of the parties are completely controlled by Wall Street, and then people on the right are like, oh, that's just a conspiracy theory, stuff like that.
yeah, and then you have Epstein and 2008, and maybe it's a little bit true on both sides.
Yeah.
It's like, oh God, maybe these, yeah.
Pompous unity.
I know. I know. I don't know what. That's what's crazy is, where do you see politics in America going?
Not good places.
So
I'm going to be honest.
yeah,
The Trump administration is disturbing. The subversion of the media. Well, I don't love the American media. Don't get me wrong, but the subversion of the media and the point where people are questioning things, which you'd think would be good, but they are kind of starting to get their media from sources that are way off to the fringes, and that's a bit disconcerting on both ends of the political spectrum. So, and
yeah,
also just the blatant disregard for checks and balances and various institutions of the United States government. I'm not like a big, oh, the Constitution is super sacred, we should never change it. Oh, the US government bureaucracy is amazing and perfect. No, the American bureaucracy honestly kind of sucks. But it has its purpose, and while it is there, if you are in office, you are not above the law.
yeah.
I'm big about that, at least. The president shouldn't be doing whatever the hell he wants. And Trump's disregard for checks and balances on his power is very concerning. It, not to, it sounds like a conspiracy theory, and it sounds kind of like I'm really out there by saying this, but I do agree with people like Hedges and Chomsky on that Trump's reactions and place in the, like his whole place in the, I guess, non-existent narrative, because I'm not big on historical narratives, but his place in the narrative of where American politics is going is a sign that we are an empire in decline that is dangerously close to slipping towards totalitarianism.
Yes. Okay. And so this goes back to an earlier point that I wanted to discuss with you, that I don't agree with everything Peterson says, but I think his diagnosis is correct because his main concern is a slip into totalitarianism. And I think ultimately, however misapplied some of his things about freedom of speech and the role of government may be, I think he is correct in saying that I think Trump and identity politics on both sides are an indication of an empire in decline. And we have two choices. And one choice leads down a really bad path that historically has led to millions of people getting killed or dying. And the other path is, sort of the path of however flawed we can say the founding fathers are, those policies were there, I think, not to oppress. I think that their intention was not to oppress, however, oppressive forces remained, if that makes any sort of sense.
I agree with that for the most part. There are definitely some institutions that are a bit problematic from that era, but for the most part, I don't think all of it was intrinsically problematic. I think it's important to try to change some of these things, but for the time being, as long as they're being instituted, the people who are in the government should be following them.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I'm completely in agreement. They're on the slipping into totalitarianism. Yeah, it's quite concerning because there are some disturbing, I'm not really a Hegelian. I don't view history as like following these grand narratives and like always thesis, antithesis, synthesis, but there are some scary parallels between modern America and post World War I Germany as far as the identity politics, the
Yes.
scapegoating, the mistrust of the media, and of course, we've got the failed recent micro-military actions and failed military actions recently, showing that to a certain extent, whether or not a lot of people want to admit it, our military, even though we keep throwing money at it, isn't doing what they want it to do.
Exactly. And rather than, a lot of times, like you said, we just throw money at it instead of maybe trying to scale it to a smaller size and make it a more well-regulated militia, to use the constitutional phrasing. It's interesting to me, but yeah,
Right.
so this slip into totalitarianism, I see it on both sides, right? I see it on the right in morality, and I see it on the left in morality in a different way. Where do you think that this sort of identity politics comes from on the left? Because I've kind of picked on the right a lot, but where do you think this identity politics comes from on the left?
I think it's I think it's arguably very similar on both sides. It's generally based in race, religion,
Mhm.
or on the left there is a bit of it in sex and gender identity, but I think that that stuff is such a minority on the left, it's not really having a major effect on global politics.
Oh, interesting. So, see, I see it a little bit differently in that I think that I think that the narrative of the gender and identity on the left is weaponized, and I think people weaponize that narrative to control and suppress a lot of the left's ideas.
I think it is weaponized by the right. I think it's used against the left by the right a lot.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do think there are some people who are sticking to strict identity politics due to stuff involving that on the left, but I don't think honestly I don't think on the left it's as much of an issue more as the right just using it as a weapon against them. But
Uh-huh.
there is I think on both sides of the spectrum though there's definitely a lot of issues of people viewing personal identity over. I think it's just hyper individualism on both sides of the spectrum. People are just thinking way more about themselves than the greater good. Even though as far leftists you think they'd be a little less individualistic about it, but some of their discourse does not reflect that idea.
Yeah, so I wanted to address something, and it's something that's kind of sensitive, but in academia, you're seeing domination of identity politics in the literature of some of the social sciences, like critical race theory and gender studies and these sort of things. You're seeing sort of a monopolization of identity politics, I think, and a sort of totalitarian stance in a lot of these subjects. So, what is your thought on critical theory and how it relates to academia? Because do you think it's gone too far?
I I'm sure in some places it has, but I don't see it as being at least problematic to the outside world as much. It might be a little annoying if you're trying to have critical discussion and question certain things in a class. Like I get that, but I honestly think in a lot of ways academia itself as an institution is kind of in decline and does not have that much of a political sway in a lot of ways. I can understand why a lot like the criticisms a lot of people on the right have for like, they're us in our discourse. Like, I mean, they shouldn't be being jerks to you. They should be like, just giving you a quality argument to why things are the way they are. But I honestly don't think that it's going to have a totalitarian effect on the government. I can understand how it might feel totalitarian when you're in a classroom with a teacher who has very strong opinions and simply resorts to ad hominem attacks instead of taking things apart. Like
Yeah.
that's horrendous. But I don't think it's going to have a massive effect on the world and like geopolitical issues.
Yeah, so I agree with you completely. You framed it really well, and that's really what I was thinking is I'm very apprehensive about going postgraduate in philosophy because of the sort of ad hominem ideologies that have creeped up in academia. And I guess that I'm a little worried that if I pursue philosophy to the level I want to, I don't know where the academy is going to be in 8 years. And like I said, it's like, do I want to get on the sinking ship or do I not?
I mean, I'd have to say if you are really interested, I'd recommend it, but it's definitely philosophy in higher academia, especially right now, is not friendly to people who have different ideas, and it's also very sadly not super friendly to people who aren't like the right identity either. There's a reason you don't see very many like non-white, non-male philosophy professors. Not to jump on the identity politics bandwagon or anything, but philosophy as a community is not particularly friendly to those people in this current age, which is very depressing.
It is depressing to me because I think that if you allow a diversity of ideas, then you have a more valid claim on good ones.
Yeah,
You know what
I
I
agree.
mean?
There are some ideas which I'm definitely not about giving a platform, but those are only the most fringent of ideas, like
Yes.
things based in like extreme racism, extreme sexism, and things that are in fascism in its purest sense, not in like the ad hominem sense. I don't think should be given a platform. But other than that, I think it's important to give most ideas at least a fighting chance.
Yeah. So interesting. I wanted to ask you about one of the biggest podcasters around, and I was going to frame it through a recent appearance by Ben Shapiro on his show, and that was Joe Rogan. He's kind of controversial. But what's interesting to me is that I think that the left has kind of weaponized his stance on gender to distance him from them. But then I saw recently that Ben Shapiro came on and tried to make the argument that Jewish immigrants were the same as African American people in this country. And Joe just completely dismantled his argument right from the start and was like, hold on, there's a difference between a Jewish person who fled persecution in Europe to make a better life and someone who was brought here into chattel slavery and had to face policies like redlining, being forced into communities that are impoverished by oppressive social forces, and basically just dismantled his entire argument completely and was like, racism and systematic racism is a big deal and it's something we need to address. And so I guess my thought is, what's your thoughts on taking plurality of someone's ideas, and maybe he has some bad ideas on gender, but he has some really good ideas on race, and like the value of having people like Ben Shapiro on there and challenging them. What's your thoughts on that?
Um, I think it's definitely important to have discourse between both sides. So, I mean, I think that Ben Shapiro is kind of on the edge. I think that if I don't think it's necessarily immoral to have someone like Ben Shapiro on a show like that and talk about it, because Ben Shapiro might dog whistle some things that are a little bit sus, and definitely I disagree with him on a lot of things, especially related to gender, and I do think those things to a certain extent can be hurtful, but I don't think they're necessarily detrimental to society, especially if you can dismantle them publicly. But then again, with once you get a little bit more to the extreme with like Richard Spencer types, I don't think that is moral to give people like that a platform.
No, I agree. And exactly. And like you said, Richard Spencer's rooted 100% in just white nationalism and the ethno state. And those ideas don't deserve a platform. I agree with you completely on that. I think there is a point where you say, no, this is not okay. For
Right.
sure.
Yeah, it's important to draw that line properly, because I am not one to promote censorship, but I'm also against hate speech, especially in its worst forms.
Yeah. And, you got someone like, I think another political person that you have to kind of dismiss, but unfortunately was elected, was David Duke. I think Richard Spencer and David Duke kind of run on that same line of just the like abhorrent racism that you just can't have. But then it's interesting when you have someone like Ben Shapiro who kind of is definitely dog whistles some things, and I think does it on purpose. I think he weaponizes controversy for his own public image in a lot of ways.
Oh yeah, he does. Like this recent thing with like this recent meme making fun of him for like reading of that song that came out. Like I
What
think he
after
definitely
the
does
word?
some of the he does some of this stuff on
Yeah,
purpose just so he'll get more money and get more
yeah,
views. I'm
yeah.
convinced that a decent amount of these right-wing people on the internet, not all of them, but I'm convinced to a certain extent some of them don't actually believe everything they're saying,
Hmm.
or at least play up certain things just because the controversy and the clickbait and the people on the fringes are how they make their money.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. And I think that's why someone like Rogan is so popular is because of his pluralism. Like, I don't think he adheres to any sort of ideology in the sense, strictly. And I think that's why he's so popular. But like you said, I think we have to find that line, and I think it's one you have to draw when you get into racism,
Yes, I completely agree.
blatant racism for sure. And I think that blatant sexism, like things where people promote like, oh, women shouldn't be in the workforce or
Right.
something like that. Like that's something you have to draw a line and say, okay, no, that's not something we put in public discourse.
And blatant things like, women shouldn't be in the workforce and the same as far as people in the LGBT community,
Oh, yes, yes.
like there are definitely there's debate on to what extent certain things could be considered hate speech and not, and I will concede that, but there shouldn't be any laws like keeping them from living their lives.
Yes, like
And,
okay, like you can't not hire someone because they're trans or because
right.
they're gay or lesbian. Like I think that should be out completely. Or like the issue that was so stupid, like a bakery shouldn't be allowed to say we're not going to provide a service for you because you're gay. Like that's the same as saying we're not going to serve you because you're black. I'm sorry, but it is.
Right.
You know?
And it's funny how the right complains about that, and then, they say, "Oh, that's so horrible," and then platforms will stop doing ads for like PragerU, and then they'll be like, "Oh my gosh, this is censorship," and I'm like, "You can't have it both ways.
No, you
You gotta
can't.
pick one."
Yeah. And I think it's the great hypocrisy right now of the right is that we want to regulate morality, but our morality. You're not allowed to have your morality.
Yeah, exactly.
You know? Yeah, that's really I think that's really good, and I think that's the line you have to draw is when it's just blatant discrimination. We can't have it.
It is. It's horrendous, and we need to do our best to deal with it as well as we can with the tools we have available.
Yes, and
Because we
so
certainly live in a society that is extremely both systemically and not systemically prejudiced and racist and sexist, and we have to combat that at every turn. We have to basically wake up every morning and be cognizant of it and do our best to fight against it.
yes, I agree 100%, and I think I think philosophy can be used as a liberating tool, but I think we also have to acknowledge the elitism in it.
Yeah, because philosophy can be used as a tool for both good and evil.
Hmm.
Like, for example, like even though Nietzsche himself was super problematic, but he was anti-nationalism
Yeah.
and anti-Semitism. But his sister took his writings and construed them and reworked them in order to support her own Nazi ideology.
Yes. And like you said, Nietzsche was definitely not, he would not have considered himself a Nazi in any sense, but that doesn't mean his
Yeah,
ideas weren't used that way,
exactly.
and you gotta watch it because I think that one of the things I wanted to ask you about was Nietzsche's big concern, I think, was what do we do now that we don't take God as seriously as we used to? So to you, what's the antidote to a secular, like, how do we make secular morality viable?
I mean, I think it's important for everyone to create their own moral system that works for them. But in my experience, and this is me personally, this might not be universal to quote my main man Kant, it's to take what's best from various forms of moral philosophy and make them work for you. Like generally my view of the world is people in my comment section have been bugging me about talking about my morality forever. So here you go. Um, Basically, I view the world from a Kantian deontological point of view,
Okay.
until I'm doing an action where following the moral law that I've developed through the categorical imperative and through my study creates negative utility. I just look at my actions critically. I tend to lean towards deontology, but I look at things critically. And if I look at a decision like, oh, I shouldn't lie, but if I make a quick white lie here, it will protect someone's feelings or really help a situation. And it's just much better from a utilitarian point of view. So I'm not going to just blindly follow the imperative, because I think what's most important is just to be critical morally in our current day and age. Since there's no since at least I personally don't think there's a transcendental, and there's no universal transcendental that everyone believes in, I think it's just important to learn as much as you can about morality and then think critically with that knowledge.
Okay, that's totally a distillation of where I'm at currently. And like I said, it may change, but I think, like you said, the most important thing I think is critical thinking about your moral decisions. Just giving, and I think it's like and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what you're saying here is that, first of all, your moral life needs to be activated. That's the most important thing. Yeah, I think that that's really what you're pushing towards, is like, let's have an active moral life rather than a passive one.
Right. You don't want to just like decide, okay, I'm going to be a divine command theorist, or okay, I'm going to be a deontologist, and then just follow that forever and just not think about it. I don't think that is conducive to a good life or being a productive member of society.
Yeah, I think that it's lazy too,
Oh
honestly.
yeah, definitely.
And I think that that's sort of the problem with, and I think we forget that America is not the only place in the world that has problems, because I think sometimes we're so individualistic that we think, oh, America's the whole world. And, we're seeing right-wing politics rise in Britain, in France. We're seeing totalitarianism in Russia and China. And all of these, I think that it's interesting to me, and I'm sure you'll have some thoughts on this, why that globalism is just a reality that we have to deal with. But why do you think that globalists, like a lot of, and you said don't use the word conspiracy theory, but why do you think that a lot of these conspiracies hinge on avoiding globalism?
I think it's because that a lot of people, especially on the right, view history in the sense of narratives, in the sense of great men, and in the sense of personal national identity.
Okay.
And they see in the modern era, especially with the internet, a lot of national identity stuff starting to dissolve a little bit. And nationalism, in a lot of ways, at least really being challenged.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not comfortable with that.
Okay.
They
So,
see themselves as, the best and being patriotic and like, oh yeah, America #1, and they don't want to see things become more global in that sense. They fear a global elite that will make them, less important and amazing as Americans.
okay, so that's really interesting. I never thought about it from that framework. Now, I had thought about it from that framework in terms of my disagreements with Marx, in that I think that Marx views history the same way the right does in America right now. He views it through the lens of historical narratives rather than sort of I don't think that you can view it that way, because history is written by the victors, and I think that is a truth. And I think you can't always view history strictly from what we get in history books. I think you have to kind of use a plurality of sources, and I think
Exactly.
that's really
Yeah.
important.
Marx is a product of, he's a modernist philosopher, and he like learned from Hegel and Hegel's view of history, like the dialectical view of history. And like what you said is you basically explained like a big problem a lot of postmodernists have with both Marx and Hegel. They're taking into question these great historical narratives and, like, in the case of at least Derrida, deconstructing them.
Mm-hmm. And I think that can go too far as well. And if you take postmodernism too far, I think you journey into nihilism, which is not productive to me either.
I don't think that's the case, honestly. I think that postmodernism by nature is just about questioning modernism and earlier ideas. And I think that questioning and thinking critically is extremely important. And
Hmm.
I think the descent into nihilism is theoretically possible, but pretty much all great philosophers are against nihilism because nihilism is truly the enemy of philosophy.
Yes.
Because if nothing matters, why are you thinking? Why are you being critical? Why are you fighting anything? Like the closest thing to nihilists we have in philosophy are some of the existentialists. And that's their starting point is nihilism, and they're coming up with ways to combat it. Like for Nietzsche, that's the Übermensch.
Hmm.
For Camus, that's absurdism, imagining Sisyphus is happy, being happy and rebellious in the face of nothingness.
Hmm.
So I don't think anyone who truly calls themselves a philosopher or can make that descent into nihilism without a certain level of cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, I agree with you completely, and I think that this descent into nihilism maybe comes from a very shallow point of view of postmodernism, but I think that there is a lot of very shallow postmodernist thinking out there because of, and I'm going to show my elitism a little bit here, but the internet has really made these ideas accessible to anyone, and I think that if you read someone like Derrida or Foucault and you read, simulacra simulation, I think we're seeing a lot of people just going, oh, this is all a simulation. Everything is meaningless. I see that. And I think it's
Yeah.
really an indicator of the rise of, like, in our generation, you see the rise of depression and anxiety. And I think it's because people are not taking the time to ground themselves in a morality, like you're saying, and give their lives meaning. And like you said, like Nietzsche says, becoming the better man,
Right.
becoming from the existentialist point of view, saying, kind of screw you, I'm going to be happy pushing this boulder.
Right. And I do think a lot of the nihilism that's associated with postmodernism does come from a very surface level reading of it.
Hmm.
I think that like I think that postmodernism is designed to combat these things, but simply reading Simulacra and Simulation, which I'm currently doing, it's such a hard read. Um,
It is.
simply just getting out of that everything is simulated and therefore nothing matters is not the point that Baudrillard was trying to make.
No,
Like, I'm
yeah.
going to talk about another one of his works for a second, like The Gulf War Never Happened. The point of it isn't to like downplay the importance of the Gulf War or like promote nihilism. The point of it is just to explain that for people who did not experience the war, for people who weren't living in that part of the world, and people who didn't fight in the military during that, like people that were not there, it did not happen. They simply experienced a simulation that the media gave to them. And it's just thinking critically about our perception of reality, less about the meaning of reality itself.
Yes, and I think that that's kind of a shallow criticism of postmodernism, is that, oh, the only thing it's meant to do is destroy objective truth. No, that's not what postmodernism is trying to do. It's not trying to, and you see in these really shallow readings of it, some academics are trying to say that, like, things like mathematics are an oppressive force against people of, like, SJWs, like you did the quotes before.
Yeah.
Like, no, mathematics is not a tool to destroy trans and gay people with a different way of learning. Like, I think anyone who's academically honest would say that mathematics is not necessarily an oppressive force. I would say it's a liberating force. And I think that what we have to do is we have to remember that when we think critically, we have to take the good with the bad, and we have to
Right.
look at these systems and say, okay, historically, white straight men are the only people that have been allowed to play with these ideas. Let's promote diversity. Let's promote plurality of ideas, and let's promote critical thinking, and let's build this ground, and
Right.
let's take this existentialist framework and create order out of chaos, like in Genesis, right? You know?
No. And it's also important to realize that, well, like in Western society, it has been the case that only straight white men could play with it, that there's a lot of, especially philosophy, math, they aren't as bad about this, honestly. Like math is better about acknowledging where various things came from. But for example, like we've got like philosophers like Zeri Yacob from Ethiopia, who basically came up with Descartes' ontology and Rousseau's social contract
Yeah.
years before they did, but because he did it in a cave in Ethiopia, not that many people outside of Ethiopia know about it,
Hmm.
which is kind of criminal and problematic, but I do my best to occasionally promote him on my channel to the best of my ability. And when people ask me about my favorite philosophers, I mention him and I do my best to promote him because, I think that Eurocentrism is, for the most part, problematic. I can understand why, especially with colonialism, for your readings of history, you have to do a certain amount of quote unquote Eurocentrism, but like completely getting all your ideas, looking at all of history and all of humanity from a Eurocentric point of view is detrimental to anyone.
Yeah, it's like, I don't know if you're familiar with Jane Elliott, but I love her complete takedown of Eurocentrism and saying that if people actually acknowledge the contributions of the Nile Valley and Africa to civilization, there would be no room for racism because Black people and Africans created basically civilization as we know it. And we acknowledge it like it's all these white men from Europe created civilization. That's not true at all.
Civilization came to Europe late.
Yes.
Like
Yeah.
if you look at like where civilization developed, you got like, Mesopotamia, then you got like the Indus Valley civilizations, then you got like China and Egypt. And what was going on in America was a bunch of what was going on in Europe was a bunch of basically hunter-gatherer stuff until the Roman Empire, essentially. I mean, there was little bits and pieces in Greece and like parts of and various little dots around the northern parts of the Mediterranean, but nothing comparable until the Roman Empire and after.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with you completely. So can you repeat that guy's name from Ethiopia? Because I'm showing my ignorance. I had no idea who that guy was, and that's probably because of, like you said, this Eurocentrism in education.
Yeah, his name's Zara Yacob. That's Zeryacob.
Zeriacob. Okay, I'm definitely
Yep.
going to read some of him. That's awesome, man. Thanks for teaching me something.
Oh yeah, I'm more than happy to give people philosophy recommendations.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. I'm definitely going to add that to my my repertoire. And I just want to thank you again for taking the time today to talk with me about this stuff. I love doing this. I hope maybe sometime you'll
Oh
be.
yeah, it was a great time. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks. And please shout out your page on TikTok and let everybody know where they can find you.
You cut out for a second. I'm sorry.
Just shout out your page on TikTok and your Instagram, whatever you want to. Tell people where they can find
Oh
you.
yeah, I am rousshoe, so Roussshoe. It's a pun on Rousseau on TikTok. My Instagram and my YouTube are also in the bio. I mostly am doing TikTok stuff these days, but I've got some YouTube stuff in the works. It's just, I've been busy with some summer classes and hopefully I'll get to that. But yeah, check that out. Give me a like, give me a shout out if you like philosophy and occasional other humanities content.
Awesome, man. Keep doing good work. And if you like the show, please like and subscribe on YouTube. It helps the channel very much. We're just starting out. We're growing. If you want to listen to the audio only version of this podcast, you can find us on Apple under Hayden's Happy Hour and soundcloud.com/Hayden's Happy Hour. I want to thank you again, Jonathan, for joining me today. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Aiden.